Hi, a little quickie, and this week it's a little quickie that comes from my last little quickie that came from my quickie before that. And that's because in my prior video I mentioned that I prefer to cut dry with a tap when tapping steel than to use lubricating oil such as engine oil. And, well, one of my followers, or one of the persons who signed up to my YouTube channel in France, wrote to say that, well, he would rather use motor oil than not use anything. And I think that's great. I mean, that's a bit what YouTube is all about. People can write in and comment, and people don't have to agree with what I say. And sometimes comments bring on other comments, and people learn through all that activity. Now, you never have to agree with me, so if you want to comment, go for it. The only thing that I won't accept and that I'll remove, and that I do remove, is if there is foul language used other than in a joking way, or if the tone is aggressive. But other than that, everything's fine, and Darty's comment fell into that category, something that is just fine. So I thought it might be good for me to maybe clarify a little bit, not completely, but a little bit, how I approach tapping with fluids. So let's take a look at that. Let's start with cutting oils versus cutting fluids. Now, cutting fluids are oil that is water soluble mixed with, obviously, water. And their main purpose is to cool down. Now, the oil does assist somewhat in the chip formation and is there also to reduce corrosion on the machines. But their principal role is to cool. Whereas cutting oils, well, are also called straight up oils because they are not mixed with water. And their main purpose is not to cool. It's to assist with chip formation. Cutting oils can be subdivided into two groups: the light cutting oils and the thick cutting oils. Now, in the light cutting oils, we're talking about things like a rapid tap, like we have here, and Tap Magic. Also could be included in this several types of degreasers for certain non-ferrous metals when we want to tap. And we're talking here about things like Varsol, kerosene, WD-40, even a mixture 50-50 dish soap and water. So that is all considered, as far as I'm concerned, to be light cutting oils. Now, if we want to get into the thick cutting oils, well, they're used for high pressure applications. And we're looking here at the type of oil like a sim tap type of tapping oil. Now, when we're talking high pressure, obviously we're talking about cutting materials that require a lot of force to produce a chip. Now, Dormer has an interesting system because they have a three-tiered system. They have Dormer Blue, or Dormer number 1 cutting oil, which is used for general purpose, mostly for steels, for tapping and that type of operation in steels, but not the very, very hard steels. Now, then they go to their Dormer number 2, which is the red cutting oil, and that's used for generally non-ferrous materials, so lower cutting pressures. And then they have the number 3, the green one, which is called a general purpose cutting oil for what I consider to be high pressure applications like broaching and certain milling and gear cutting operations. So that's the difference between the two. But how does that relate to our different materials? Now, there are several types of ferrous metals. And let's start with the simplest one as far as tapping is concerned, and that is C12L14 or the like of, in other words, all the free machining steels. Now, free machining steels is exactly what the name says. It is a steel that is very easy to machine, that produces a chip easily. And obviously with a free machining steel, well, there's not really any requirement for using a cutting oil when tapping. Then we can move on to our plain carbon and alloy carbon steels in the unhardened state. So we're talking anything from 1010, 1020, 1040, 4140, and even 01 or tool steels. In their unhardened state, these steels are difficult to cut, and they do require a reasonable amount of pressure. Now, as you move on towards the tool steel, they require progressively more pressure. The lighter or lower numbered 1010s and 1020s that are really yucky plain steel, plain carbon steels, well, they're gummy, and even in that, they do require lubrication with a cutting oil. So, those steels in that state, unhardened, well, you're going to want to use a good light cutting oil. Now, if we move on to steels that are hardened, well, obviously tool steel, once hardened, cannot be tapped, so forget about that one. But we do have a gamut of medium carbon, plain and alloy steels, and we can think of a 1040 or a 4140. And these can be hardened, and once fully hardened, well, they're a little too hard to be able to tap. But if they're drawn back to anywhere between 30 and 45 Rockwell, well, you can tap them, but obviously it's going to require a lot of pressure. So if you're going to be tapping those hardened medium carbon steels that have been drawn back, well, you probably want a slightly oversized hole. Instead of cutting 75% of a full thread, as is the case with most tapping operations, well, you probably want to shoot for 60 or 65. And you're going to want to use a very thick, high pressure situation type cutting oil. So that is my steels. But steel isn't the only type of ferrous metals. We mustn't forget our stainless steels, which is really a type of steel, but it's sort of set aside, it's apart from the others. Most stainless steels can be hardened, some can, and the ones that can, well, they produce crispy chips, and, well, I'm thinking about 74 pH H900 or something like that, that comes in around 40 Rockwells. Well, that can be tapped readily with a high pressure oil. But most other stainless steels cannot be hardened, and they're very gummy grabby materials. I mean, they are strong and they are corrosion resistant, but they do not cut well at all. So with these materials, we definitely want to oversize our holes somewhat. Again, around a 60% of a full thread would be desirable. And we're going to want to use a high pressure cutting oil because obviously it's going to be difficult to cut. Now, in my ferrous metals, we must not forget the cast irons. And in cast irons, well, we have a gamut there because there's three types of cast iron. We have gray cast iron, white cast iron, and malleable cast iron. Well, gray cast iron is pretty straightforward. It's hard, okay, but it contains a lot of free carbon. Okay, it's a hypoeutectoid ferrous material that has a lot of extra carbon in it. And carbon is a solid lubricant. So for tapping cast iron, no liquid, light or thick, is required. But there's a plus to not using any liquid when tapping cast iron. Now, if you've handled cast iron, you know that it is very full of carbon because your fingers get all dirty. And when you file or tap them, well, you make a ruddy mess. And if you add cutting oil to that when tapping, well, you get not just a mess, but a pasty mess and holes that are difficult to clear out with compressed air, and that eventually you have to use some type of degreaser just to get the dirt out of the hole. So really, I recommend for gray cast iron not using anything. It cuts quite well as it is. White cast iron is extremely hard and obviously is not machinable with traditional chip producing tooling and cannot be tapped. And finally, malleable cast iron. Well, malleable cast iron is basically normalized white cast iron, and it becomes malleable through that heat treatment, and can be treated just like any mild steel, 1010, 1020 or whatnot. So just a light cutting oil will do fine for that. Now let's talk about our non-ferrous metals. And we're going to divide them up in a bizarre way. Well, first we're going to have one section where we're going to look at pure non-ferrous, and in the shop, home shop, well, those will be pure copper, pure aluminum, and sometimes, but dangerous for your health, lead. And we're going to have our alloys, copper alloys, aluminum alloys, and that's going to be my alloyed non-ferrous metals. So let's start with the pure ones. Pure copper, pure aluminum, and pure lead. I said aluminium, but that's the French way of saying aluminum. Sorry about that. Okay, they are very difficult to cut. They do not cut well at all. And why is that? Well, they cannot form a chip because they're not dense, they're not heavy materials, and they accumulate more than they slide. And what do I mean? Well, there's 4 different stages in chip formation, as we saw in our chips, speeds, and feeds video. And the first one, well, is penetration, then compression, then chip formation, and then separation. Well, with these pure non-ferrous metals, we get penetration, we get a lot of accumulation, and it's very difficult to lift the chip. And what that means is when the tap is cutting, the leading edge of the tap teeth will accumulate material ahead of them. Sooner or later, if the chip doesn't slide, well, there gets to be too much material accumulated ahead of the tooth on the tap. And that means we can no longer move forward. Now, with a normal material that produces a chip, well, we would back off and break that chip, and then we can continue on our merry way. But if we have a material that does not produce a chip readily, well, when we come to back off, what we hit is the accumulation and not a chip. We cannot break that accumulation off, and we are de facto stuck. The chip with the tool no longer wants to move forward, and we cannot move it backwards. It is stuck. And oftentimes we'll even break taps trying to back them out of the hole with those pure non-ferrous metals. So first suggestion would be to avoid tapping them with traditional taps. Now, these pure non-ferrous metals can be readily tapped with forming taps, I should say. And these have no teeth on them, and they really displace material more than they cut. Although they do not cut at all, they just displace material. And with these forming taps that you want to use generally on a machine to get a high rate of speed, well, you're going to want to use neither a light cutting or heavy cutting oil. You're going to want to use a lubricating oil. So that's really something that is generally not accessible in the home shop. It's not something you want to do. But my alloy non-ferrous metals, well, there's something that we want to be able to tap. So let's take a look at those. Now, as we've seen in our materials class, our copper alloys divide into 2 major families. We have brass and we have bronze. Now, each one of those subdivide into several different types, but as a general rule, brass cuts quite readily and forms nice, crisp, and very curly chips. And that means that in many cases we can tap brass without using any cutting oil whatsoever. But if you are going to use cutting oil, well, use a light cutting oil. The only brass you have to watch out for is naval brass. That is quite hard and quite tough. So with that, you're going to definitely want to use a cutting oil, and maybe even a thick high pressure oil. Bronze, however, produces powdery discontinuous chips. Now, this helps with the cutting action because it clears easily, and we can often cut the holes, cut the threads all the way through without backing out, and that's fine. But bronze is a very hard and tough material. So with bronze, in many cases, you're going to want to use a high pressure cutting oil. Now, be aware, there is one bronze, beryllium copper really, which is a bronze, that is dangerous to cut because the fumes are quite toxic. And in that case, well, you're probably going to want to use a flood just to keep those fumes down, or just avoid machining it altogether, which is a much better situation. Now, as we've said, our pure aluminum is really quite difficult to cut and shouldn't be cut at all really, it should be formed. But there are alloys of aluminum that are really nice to machine, that produce nice crispy chips. And these alloys in their T6 condition, well, can be readily tapped with a light or very light cutting oil. And we're talking here about 20, 24, 60, 61, 70, 75, and all three in their T6 state. Now, in our materials class, we do have a course that talks about non-ferrous metals, and we're the one that talks about aluminum. So if you don't understand any of that, take a look at those. But for us, we can say that those alloys are easily tapped, but they can clog up quite easily, because you have to remember that aluminum's melting point is quite low. So you want to use a light cutting oil or a very light cutting oil. And when we talk about very light cutting oils, well, those are those degreasers I was talking about at the very start. So Varsol, WD-40, that type, and even a mixture of 50-50 dish soap and water works quite well. Be aware though, if you're tapping on a machine or machining point final and you use these degreaser types oils and they fling around on your machine, they do make quite a mess, and they do attack things like bearings readily. So really keep those for bench work. Lesson 5 in my lessons section had to do with bench work, and part 2 really has to do with taps and tapping. So you might want to take a look at that. Lesson 6 is materials, and there's going to be a lot of discussion there about non-ferrous materials. So if that interests you, go take a look at that. I have a little Quickie 15, that is in 2 halves. The first half is about the spin indexer, and that's not important for tapping. But the second half of that video presents or discusses or looks at cutting oils and cutting liquids or coolants, and that could be interesting. Well, as well as we have our ferrous materials videos in my shop video section. And in that same section, well, we have the chips, speeds, and feeds part 1 and 2. So you might want to go check those out. I was watching an A-Bomb video the other day, and he was showing off his really nice new sports car that he'd just bought. And he said, well, I've been working very hard, and it was time for me to sort of go after it. I've been thinking about it for a long time, and I went out and I got myself this car. And I thought that was just great. And I said, you know what? I work hard as well, and I deserve something like that, or I would want something like that. And it reminded me of a childhood dream or fantasy, and that was to own one day a 1963 ragtop Corvette. One beautiful car. Well, I finally decided to do it. And I went out and I bought one. It's going to need a little work. I mean, it's an old model, but I'm going to get at it and get it all fixed up. So, you want to see it? Here it is. Like I said, it's an old model and it's going to need some work. So you can see that I lied. Well, not about the car, about the fact that I've worked hard lately. That's not true at all. Vive le retirement. So to everyone out there, have fun, be safe, and happy machining.